Welcome to What the Friday, the After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listening discretion is advised.
I think that we can all agree that a man's or a woman's home is their castle. But how far does that go? Most states in the U.S. have some form of the castle doctrine, meaning that you have the right to legally defend your home and family. In the state of Minnesota, the law states the intentional taking of a life of another is not authorized except when necessary in resisting or preventing an offense which the actor reasonably believes exposes the actor or another to great bodily harm or death, or preventing the commission of a felony in the actor's place of abode. The key word there is reasonably, meaning you can't just shoot someone because they're in your home. A line has to be drawn between defending yourself and premeditated murder. Good evening and welcome to an all-new episode of What the Friday. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right now that many of the details of this episode are very disturbing, so listener discretion is advised. Byron David Smith was who his neighbors described as a somewhat quiet man, but he was very friendly. After retiring from his federal job, he moved back to the small town of Little Falls, Minnesota. Now, Smith was never married, nor did he have any kids, and after his mom passed away, he was pretty much alone there. Little Falls is a quiet town, and from the description I found of it in my research, it sounds a lot like my hometown. Everyone is friendly and looks out for each other, but there's absolutely nothing for the kids to do after school outside of sports. As quiet as Little Falls is, there's still, the little small crimes that any town would have. Smith claimed that his home had been burglarized several times. So Smith decided to install security cameras around the perimeter of his house just in case anything ever did happen again. He was so afraid that he'd be burgled again that he rarely left his home. Even though he had reported the break-ins to the local authorities in the fall of 2012, he decided to take the law into his own hands and become the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Haley Keifer and Nick Brady were cousins, but they were also the best of friends. You rarely saw one without the other. 17-year-old Nick is described as being into sports, and he always had a smile on his face. 18-year-old Haley was also into sports and enjoyed working part-time jobs. Other than being like the normal knucklehead kids that, doing what teens will do, their grandparents described them as being really good kids. On Thanksgiving Day of 2012, Haley and Nick were supposed to eat Thanksgiving dinner with Nick's grandparents and parents. When dinner was ready, but there was no sign of Nick or Haley, Nick's grandmother started to worry. As the day wore on, there was still no sign of either of the teens, and calls to Nick's cell phone went to voicemail. When darkness fell over the town, Nick's grandmother called the authorities and asked if there had been any car accidents, and when they were told no, I'm sure she probably had this sinking feeling in her gut or her heart, but she was told that she had to wait 24 hours to file a missing persons report. Meanwhile, over on Elm Street, Smith lie in wait, much like a hunter waits for their intended target to walk out in front of them. He hunkered down in his basement where he could monitor his security cameras and be ready when trouble came calling. And it did. Just a few hours into Smith's vigilant waiting, he saw activity on his security monitors. He could see a young man approaching the back of his home, and then that young man looked into the basement window. A few minutes later, there was a crashing sound of glass breaking, then footsteps that were getting closer and closer. Suddenly, those footsteps were on the basement stairs, and that's when Smith fired his first shot. The young man fell down the stairs, and Smith fired 2 more rounds, killing the young man. A few minutes later, Smith hears someone else's footsteps coming through his home, so he readies himself again. And he kills for the second time. This time he would fire a total of 6 shots into the person that he claimed that he thought was a burglar. Earlier that day, Nick had left his grandparents' house to pick up Haley and his parents to bring them all back to his grandparents' house for Thanksgiving dinner. Well, while he and Haley were out, they drove past Smith's home and saw that no one appeared to be home, presenting the perfect opportunity to pull a quick break-in. Now, Haley stayed behind while Nick approached the home, and he probably figured it would be quick and easy, and then they would be on their way. Time passed, and Haley was becoming frantic because Nick hadn't came back, so she decided to go see what the holdup was. Nearly 24 hours later, Smith calls a neighbor and asks him to get in touch with a lawyer and have them come out to his home. The neighbor thought that was odd and it must be something serious, so instead he decided to call the sheriff's department. Shortly after arriving on the scene and assessing the situation, Smith was taken into custody, and what he told investigators in the interrogation started off quite normally. When read his Miranda rights, he stated that he understood and waived his right to have an attorney present during questioning. Now, this is strictly my opinion, y'all, but to me, I believe Smith thought that it was pretty cut and dry, and he would just be on his merry way back to his house in just a matter of time. He also stated that the first break-in at his home had happened 12 to 15 years ago, and he said that just after he claimed that it had been the same people breaking into his home each time. He believed that it was a neighbor named Ashley Williams that had been breaking into his home over those years. Now, he had no proof of it, but someone had seen her wearing a jacket that he knew had been stolen out of his garage. As recent as 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving day, his home had been broken into while he was out shopping one day. Now, things get more interesting when he starts telling the investigator what happened on Thanksgiving Day. He started by saying that he stayed home even though he had been invited to a friend's house for Thanksgiving. While he was in the basement in his favorite reading chair reading a paperback book, around noon he says he hears someone rattling the upstairs door by the garage. Then he sees a shadow pass the basement window just before someone starts rattling the basement door. The person continues rattling different doors trying to find a way in, and Smith says he's starting to get a bit distressed because of that situation. After a moment of silence, he hears a glass window break in. He goes on to tell the investigator that for the past month, his life has been very unhappy. He hadn't slept well because he had been repeatedly victimized. During those past couple of weeks, he had gotten into the habit of carrying firearms with him inside of his house because he says he didn't know when someone may decide to break in again. He says after the window broke, he heard footsteps come down the hallway, turn around, and then began coming down the basement stairs. He stated that he figured that anyone who would steal guns wouldn't be afraid to use guns. And that stemmed from some of his firearms being stolen in an earlier burglary. Then he says he figures he has the choice of shooting or being shot. Without any emotion, he states that the guy came down the steps and he shot him. After he killed the first intruder, he moved the body onto a tarp that he had in a workshop area of the basement, and then he sat down so that he could calm down. Now, somewhere, in his words, somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes later, he hears more footsteps coming down the hallway and then starts down the stairs. He then shot the second intruder the same way as the first, except in his words, after that, the first shot, that second intruder tumbled down the stairs. Then he walked over to finish that person off, and his Mini 14 jammed. Now, in his version of events, he says that when the weapon jammed, the second intruder laughed at him. So So he pulled out his .22 revolver from his hip holster and shot them twice. Next, he moves his second intruder onto that same tarp, and then he noticed that the second intruder was still faintly gasping, so he placed the revolver under their chin and pulled the trigger. He tells the investigator that no matter how much he hates someone, they don't deserve pain, and he called it a good, clean finishing shot. An hour later, he says that he checked both intruders for a pulse, but there was none. For the rest of that day and into the next morning, he waited for another accomplice to show up. When he was questioned by the investigator about what he had been wearing during the shootings, he stated that he had been wearing a different pair of pants, but sometime after it had gotten dark, he had sneaked up to his bedroom and got another pair of pants. The pants he had been wearing at the time of the shootings, he had folded up and stuffed them behind a stereo in the basement. Also, during the interrogation, Smith consented to giving a DNA sample and having his fingerprints taken. Now, there's a lot to the interrogation that lasted just over an hour, and I'm really just giving you the highlights there, but I'm going to link the video of the interrogation on our social media pages. Now, the last thing from the interrogation that I would like to mention came near the very end of it. The investigator asked him why he hadn't called law enforcement to report what had happened. I mean, he had a working phone sitting right next to him. Well, Smith said for the first couple of hours, he was just shaking. And then he shifted into worrying about another accomplice. And then he says something that just totally blew my mind. I'm not sure if it was an attempt at some humor or what, but he says that he just thought because his Thanksgiving was screwed up, he didn't need to screw up theirs, referring to law enforcement. Now, I'm sure to Smith it probably sounded pretty cut and dry, but as I listened to the interrogation, I noticed a couple of times that he seemed to be laying details on extra thick. For instance, several times he mentioned that he had the Mini 14 to shoot the beavers that destroyed the trees on his property and some muskrats. He even mentioned that the blood on the pants that he had hidden behind the stereo would be a mix of human and beaver blood. And he was oddly specific about locations pertaining to the house, like say in the northwest corner. And to be honest, a lot of it sounded very rehearsed. But the biggest thing that stood out to me is that even though he's claiming self-defense, it seems to me that shooting and killing two people would tear your nerves up at least a little bit. But his voice sounds like very calm, and everything he said had a matter-of-fact vibe to it. You know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that Intruder 1 and Intruder 2 were Nick Brady and Haley Keifer. In the days following their deaths and Smith's arrest, a lot of shocking information would come out. For one thing, it was found out that Nick had been suspected in participating in several other burglaries with some of his friends. But the most shocking evidence and information that came out about the entire case would be found in the words of Byron Smith. Among the items that were taken from the home of Smith were a voice recorder, his computer hard drive, and multiple storage devices. These were taken to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for analysis. When checking what was on the DVR for the security cameras, the agent could see Nick walking around the house to several doors, checking to see if he could open them. But after they had viewed everything from that point on, the agent decided to go back to the beginning of the footage from earlier in the day. From several different cameras, Smith could be seen leaving in his truck, and then just a little while later, he was seen walking into his yard from a completely different direction than he had left. The truck wasn't driven back to the home, so what did he do with the truck? Now, it was Thanksgiving Day, so dropping it off at a mechanic was probably out of the question. And from the video, it was clear that he had walked back from wherever he had taken the truck. Had he taken his truck somewhere else to make it look like no one was at home to lure the burglars to his home? He certainly didn't mention leaving at all during the day, during his interrogation, so I believe that's entirely possible. The 2 days leading up to Thanksgiving, surveillance recordings revealed that Nick had been scoping out Smith's house. This is probably why Smith thought that he would be back. But the fact remains that Smith hid his truck and lured those teens to his house by making him think he wasn't home. Next, the agent started listening to a 6-hour-long audio file from the voice recorder and couldn't believe what she was hearing. Smith had recorded the entire incident with the recorder, and tonight I'm going to play the main parts of that for you. Some of it has been censored, but I do warn you that it is a bit disturbing. So it's about 5 minutes long, so if you want to skip past that, it won't hurt my feelings.
You're dead. Oh, sorry about that. You're dying. Bitch. Cute. I'm sure she thought she was a real pro. I feel a little bit safer. Not totally safe. I'm still shaking a bit, but a little bit safer. I refuse to live in fear. I am not a bleeding heart liberal. I felt like I was cleaning up a mess. Not like spilled food. Not like vomit. Not even like diarrhea. The worst mess possible. In some tiny little respect. I was doing my civic duty. Because the law enforcement system couldn't handle it. I had to do it. I had to do it. They weren't human. I don't see them as human. I see them as vermin. This bitch was going to go through her life spoiling things for other people. Thieving, robbing, drug use. It's all fun, cool, exciting, and highly profitable until somebody kills you. Like I'd give a damn who she is. I'm sorry. So much regret. I try to be a good person. I try to do what I should, be friendly to other people, help them when I can. Try to be a good citizen, not cheat people, be fair. And because I try to be a decent person, they think I'm a patsy, I'm a sucker. They think I'm there for them to take advantage of. Is that the reward for being a good person? And if I gather enough evidence, they might be prosecuted. If they're prosecuted, it might go to court. If it goes to court, they might be found guilty. If they're found guilty, they might spend 6 then they're out, and they need money worse than ever, and they're filled with revenge. I cannot live a life like that. I cannot have that chewing on me for the rest of my life. I cannot. I refuse to live with that level of fear.
Now, from the beginning, you can hear the glass break, footsteps, and then shots rang out. You can hear Smith tell Nick, "You're dead." 11 minutes pass after the time that he shot Nick. The audio was edited 4 times, so I just want to say that some of it was, most of the silence was like edited out, but then you can hear more footsteps and more gunfire. But when the Mini 14 jams, you can hear him say, "Sorry about that." And if you notice, Haley never laughed at him like he had said she did in the interrogation. I mean, it was a complete lie. But she did say, "Oh my God, I'm sorry." She was apologizing to her murderer. She was pleading for her life. As he continues with his 22 revolver, sorry, this really bothers me, but as he continues with his 22 revolver, he says, "You're dying, bitch." Throughout the recording during the time of the shooting, shuffling noises are heard, and that's believed to have been him dragging Nick's and Haley's bodies to the tarp. Now, I gave that recap for those who may have skipped through the audio because it is very hard to listen to, and that was just the censored version. Every time I hear it, it just breaks my heart for those kids. But what was also on the recording that wasn't included in what I played for Tom's saying is very damning also. Near the beginning of the recording, Smith is heard talking to himself as is like he's practicing future conversations. His first practice conversation is him talking to his brother Bruce. He says, "Stop by tomorrow, Bruce. No rush, but as soon as it's convenient." Then he tells his brother to park north of the house and walk in from the west side. Next, he is heard saying, "I realize I don't have an appointment, but I would like to see one of the lawyers here." After the shootings, Smith is heard saying, "Cute. I'm sure she thought she was a real pro." Then he has another imaginary phone conversation. "No rush, but when it's convenient for you. I feel a little safer now. I feel totally safe. I'm still shaking a bit." Investigators believe it was another rehearsal conversation with either his brother or maybe a friend. He's also heard saying the following, "I refuse to live in fear. I left my house at 11:30 a.m. and they were dead by 1 p.m. Then he starts talking about the mess that was made and having to clean it up. And he refers to it as being worse than like spilled food, vomit, or diarrhea. Also during their investigation, a cell phone jammer was found in the kitchen of Smith's home. Such a device would prevent a cell phone from receiving and making phone calls and block both types of cell phone signals. The jammer was high-end and about the size of a cigarette box, and they found it hidden behind a bottle of cooking oil on the counter. So even if either of the teens would have been able to call for help, they couldn't have because the signals would have been blocked. Now in 2014, Byron Smith went on trial after being charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder in the deaths of Nick Brady and Haley Keifer. On April 29, 2014, Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder with premeditation and 2 counts of second-degree murder after only 3 hours of jury deliberations. In the end, it was the audio recordings of the events that took place on Thanksgiving Day in 2012 that convinced the jury that this was not a case of self-defense. And did I mention that neither of these kids had any type of weapon on them? Smith was immediately sentenced to life in prison without parole because in Minnesota there is no death penalty. Several appeals have been filed on behalf of Smith, but all of them have been thankfully denied. Now, I'm not in any way saying it was okay that those kids were intruding in somebody else's home. They shouldn't have been there, but they certainly didn't deserve to be killed over possessions being stolen. Neither Haley or Nick had any type of weapon on them, and while Smith didn't know if they were armed or not, I believe his mentality was that of shoot first and ask questions later. And to listen to him call Haley a bitch as she's laying there taking her last breath, it just infuriates me. Now, I didn't know these kids, but as a mother, or maybe just as a human, it kills me to think that someone could be so cold and callous to do something like this to kids. I mean, they were 18 and 17, but that's still kids. Alex is the same age that Haley was when she was murdered. And since working on this episode, listening to the interrogation and the audio from the basement, it makes me even happier to see him walk in the front door every day after work. And like I mentioned earlier, no, it wasn't right that they were in somebody else's home, but who are we to judge? And don't ever say that my kid would never, because we all think our kid would never. But they can. They're human too, and like all humans, we're subject to make mistakes. I truly believe in my heart that Nick and Haley meant no harm to Smith when they entered his home. I mean, hell, they didn't even think he was there because his truck wasn't in the driveway. Well, I've had to take several breaths, I guess you could say breath breaks, while recording tonight's episode because of the emotion that builds up in me while talking about it. So I think it's a good time to wrap it up. How about we all go meditate, take a long hot bath, and go hug our kids? Y'all have a good night.